I really appreciate you coming to see this. I think the important thing to say is that this presentation is only around 10 to 12 minutes long. The purpose of this really is for you guys to actually take this out and speak to your agencies and potentially advertisers. You may remember at the beginning of the year I talked through our insight plan, our insight strategy for the year ahead. And one of the things that I said I wanted us to do was to prove the power of local beyond how we've proved it up until this point, with some hard evidence and some stats to back up why local can be so powerful as a mindset to tap into, but also from a digital perspective as well. So the focus of this presentation is really on the digital side of things. Now I would say that there are some really great stats in here that you can use, some really good sales stats which can help us get more money into big city and regional and things like that. But what I wanted to do before I got to the stats was to talk through some of the context as to why local is so powerful. And actually some of these themes are built upon what we have been taking out for the last sort of 12 months around when trust falls down and the retrenchment from globalization and more locally. So towards the end of last year, I happened to stumble across this book called The Road to Somewhere, and it really had a profound impact on me. And if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest you do. Now, this book by David Goodhart was released just after Brexit, and it was a very, very interesting take on what had happened and why we voted leave. And what he essentially said was that Britain was split into two distinct tribes in society. The first one is what he called the Anywheres. This is the elitist group in society who have dominated culture, society. They have a very global mindset. They're not wedded to a local identity. So when a good example of this is in 2008, I think it was, or 2004, I can't remember exact year, that for instance, that Tony Blair opened up the borders to Romanians when they came into the EU a full 8 years before it was actually necessarily by EU law. So a good example of that global mindset. And then he talks to the other kind of bigger 50% of the population who are what he calls the somewheres. So these somewheres are much more rooted to their local identity. But what's more is actually they fear change. It's around about 50% of the population. And what's happened over time is they have been left behind by this more elitist group in society. And what David Goodhart talks about is how Brexit specifically was a fight back from the somewheres to the anywheres. And the reason being that the somewheres and anywheres over the last 20 years have diverged completely, so that the anywheres have stopped taking the somewheres to account. And this is really important for us as a business as well, because actually what we refer to as the mass market, we're calling the modern mainstream now, is they very much embody this somewheres philosophy. So I always find it amazing when I hear stats like this, that almost 6 in 10 of people born in the UK still live within 20 miles of where they lived when they were 14. So it's not a surprise that they would naturally be wedded to a quite local identity. And when you compare that with what we would call the Upper Britain or Anywheres, if we refer to the last chart, it's much lower. Now, some of you may have already seen this slide, but I think it's worth talking through again, is that what this means is people have a very, very deep emotional connection with their local area. So using a technique called implicit response testing, where we measure people's speed of responses to questions, this helps us get under the skin of people's subconscious views, because the quicker you select something, the more subconscious it is. And what we see from this chart is people are much faster to say that their city, town and village is important to their local identity than they are things like their nationality or their region or their postcode or the north-south divide, meaning that actually local area is really, really powerful for people. And some of you may have seen this chart that we sent out a while ago, is that what this means for local news brands is they are highly, highly trusted by their readers, because they represent the area people have grown up in. And as you can see, that we're often fighting against the likes of Google and Facebook for advertising revenue, but there's no comparison in terms of where trust lies for consumers. And actually, there's a few things that come out very strongly in this new research that I'm going to talk through about how powerful local news brands are at shaping people's worldview. And there's three reasons for this. The first is that actually I talked about how most people still live within an area of where they grew up in, which means they've grown up with these local news brands. They're part of their area's identity. So what we see is that 76% of our regional readers consider these local news brands to be part of their city's identity. And what that means is actually they play a really important role in people's lives. So 2/3, they actually inform people's view of the world. And finally, in a world where most of the news you access on social media or through Google is determined by an algorithm, not by a human, actually where local news brands like ourselves can stand up is the fact that people value the editorial curation of the content. They look to these news brands to tell them what's essential to know, even if they didn't realise that it was essential for them to know. And that's incredibly powerful. And that's something that Google and Facebook and Twitter just do not have and cannot offer to their audiences and their advertisers. But one of the things that's a problem is that you would think that brands would massively want to tap into this local mindset because it's so powerful. But actually what we're seeing is that advertising and brands are struggling to tap into it. We know that some brands do this very well and we work with them, but there are lots of brands who don't. And what this means is that it actually has quite a big impact on people's view of advertising in the industry. So actually, we talked last year about how advertising speaks much more to a London-centric or Upper Britain view of the world, and that comes through very strongly. So actually, for many people, most people don't see that advertising represents them or represents the people in their local area. And crucially, there is a lack of empathy that exists because brands are not seen to understand what it's like for people living in Britain today. Partly because from that first slide I show you, that the advertising industry by its very nature are anywheres, and therefore have kind of dominated culture and kind of push their view of the world out to people that doesn't necessarily exist for people living outside of the bubble. But what's really interesting is that actually this idea of brands or advertising not portraying the lives of people in the local area is actually getting much worse over time. So we've been tracking this stat for 3 years now. And actually, you can see that between 2016 and 2018, there has been a significant increase in the people saying that advertising doesn't portray the lives of people in their local area. And, you know, in an agency, they might say, well, you know, why does advertising need to portray people in my local area? And what you would say is for all the reasons we've talked about just now, is really important why brands need to tap into this. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to showcase the importance of why thinking locally is important for brands and what that means for brands. So what we did is we did a really exciting study actually. It's how it works. So we take 6 of our regional sites and we insert advertising across a number of pages. We selected 10 pieces of advertising from advertisers. We then get some competitor sites, mainly in the programmatic space, because we feel that's where we can most get revenue from. And all we do is we simply insert the same ads on those sites as well. And then what we do is we recruit 2 samples. They see the same advertising, but the crucial difference is they're seeing it in a different context. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. And then what we did is we send people to these sites and we use an eye tracking methodology. So we actually know what they're looking on at the page, whether they've seen the advertising, and you get a heat map that looks a bit like that. Obviously that's just for effect. So what did we discover? So what we discovered, really positively for us, is that not all impressions are the same. And what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides in terms of the results is I'm going to split the data by those who we know have actually seen the ads, because we know from their eye tracking methodology whether their eyeballs have actually looked at it, versus those who haven't seen the ads, because I think that's where the power of these results come through very strongly. And what we do is we've averaged it all up on the 10 advertisers. So just to explain this chart here, the red represents non-viewed ads. So we can see that on non-TMS sites, the average score for the advertisers aiming at this advertising at people in my local area is 48%. And that's for people whose eyeballs didn't even see the ads. What we can see is when they have actually seen the ads, the advertising has had very little effect on non-TMS sites. When we look at TMS regional sites, we see a difference. Basically, when people actually see the ads, we start to see the power of that context coming through. We see a significant uplift. It's the same with understanding people in my local area. For a viewed ad on a non-TMS site, it makes no difference whatsoever. So if you're advertising on your competitor sites, it doesn't matter if someone's seen the ad or not, it's not going to improve their perception of the advertiser. But on our sites, naturally, that local context, we see a big increase in people perceiving that brand to understand people, to empathise with consumers. It also has a really dramatic impact on consumers' trust in brands. Now, with the non-TMS sites in terms of perception of the advertiser being reliable, I think what's quite interesting is we do see an uplift for non-TMS sites, because actually we know that advertising does work to a certain extent. You're more likely to have a perception of a brand if you see the ad or not. But actually, it's much more significant when people see it on our sites. But the biggest uplift we see is around trustworthy. I talked before about how trustworthy local media is, how powerful the context is. So if you're placing ads on these programmatic competitors, you might as well not bother. It's not going to do anything for the brand's perceptions of being trustworthy. But if you place it in our context, 19 percentage points difference. So it just goes to show how powerful that trustworthy environment is for our readers. It's really quite significant, very powerful. But what that means as well is that we also see a bigger call to action, so around the back end of the purchase funnel, like consideration. So an ad appearing on our site is much more powerful than on a non-TMS site. So we see a much greater recommendation for the brand, and also a greater consideration and purchase intent. So really exciting results. And actually, I'm just going to finish off with just a kind of summary slide in terms of why the power of local is so strong and why brands can see such an uplift by advertising in our environment. I guess the first thing to say is that brands, we're selling impressions and digital numbers and things like that, but ultimately what a brand is buying is impact on their brand. So actually, we provide a trusted environment that rubs off on the advertising brands. And actually, we know that there is a strong local affinity amongst our readers, and actually this gives the opportunity for national brands to tap in to the local affinity that exists. And then we know also that this local affinity has a massive increase on trust. This rubs off massively on the advertising brands, and this increased trust and reliability boosts recommendation and consideration. So as I mentioned, it's quite a short, sharp deck. We'll produce one-pagers for you. There will be a script that will accompany this presentation for you to take out. Our team, the Insight team, are also happy to come with you and present this if you'd like. No? Okay. All right. Well, we'll share it around.
Thank you.